Hi,
How are you?
I'm good.
Very annoying, Zoom, you have to either call, like have the number, or you have to be admitted to through the waiting room. You can't just get in anymore because they've had such trouble with people, bombing the Zoom call. So this is going to be, I have to let people in. It's
You have to
annoying.
watch.
I have to watch, exactly.
Can you make it so that anyone can share the screen?
Yeah, I did that. Let me just double check. Share screen. Multiple participants can share simultaneously.
But there's another one that it's not, well, okay. It's not so much simultaneous, but
I know. Um,
I'm going to try to share mine right now. See what
okay. Okay, good.
you see my, I don't
I
know,
see. Whoops.
wait, launch. So you see that, right?
Yep, I see your screensaver.
It's Eastchester Bay, yeah.
Yep,
All right, I'll stop sharing. So that means he can share.
exactly. That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Was so interesting, this meeting with the mayor.
yeah, so how'd it go? I missed you guys talking about it because I got onto Maria's call late. So what's the story?
Well, it was really good. The mayor, Biaggi, and the other senator from Co-op City was there. Her and different her chief of staff and stuff.
Here come
But
people.
oh, who's there?
Ellen Riley and Barbara Jones.
So maybe I should wait.
It's interesting though to talk about it, right? Just
So yeah, this is what was interesting, was that there was his let's see, what did he, Public Works, the Commissioner of Public Works for Mount Vernon was on the call, and the top engineer was there. And they've been working from funds that they've scraped together from before COVID and stuff, because they were hoping to get a big grant from what's called Save Mother Nature.
I read about that. That's Cuomo's big money.
Yeah, there's
then it was
but that's been put on hold.
exactly.
But they've gotten other money, and they've been working hard to fix what they call the projects. They call them there are 7 projects that they're being sued for by the federal government and the state in terms of their sewers. And they were explaining, I'm talking about the commissioner and the engineer, what they've been doing. And they were explaining, and it was complicated, and it took a while to understand. But there's what they call the sanitation sewers, some of them are on top of the storm sewers.
Right.
And if the sanitation sewers are leaking, which a bunch of them are, they leak into the storm sewers, which means that at various times in rains and other things, all that sanitation sewage, which comes right from the homes, goes into the river.
So that's the problem. And that's one big storm. I remember, like with the sailing program, after a big storm, you couldn't literally swim for like you couldn't have the kids get in the water for 3 days.
Right.
And that's all from that problem, right? From the hut, that's all flowing in the hut?
No, there's more to it. Just wait.
Okay.
So that's what we're trying to understand. And the actual specifics of it, in terms of being sanitation sewers above storm sewers. And, they were trying to explain that, and they fixed this one and they fixed that one, and they've been working on it, and they hope to get this money. And we committed that we would help them in any way we could. And, there was a lot of positive vibing going on.
Good.
And then Aji at like around 10 minutes towards the end said, she kayaked up the hutch to the treatment plant, which apparently is right below the target.
Here comes Chester Zarnoch.
Okay, we'll talk about later. You there?
He's coming on now. Hi, Chester.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Fine, thanks. Nice to meet you. My name's Sally Connolly. I've met you via email.
Hi,
Sally.
Chester. I'm
Barbara Zom.
Hi, Barbara. Nice to meet you both.
Yep.
We're both with City Island Oyster Reef, and Barbara Jones and Ellen Riley are volunteers also with City Island Oyster Reef.
Okay,
I think
great.
they might be muted right now and doing something else right this moment, but welcome, Chester.
Thank you. I'm happy to meet you guys and to talk to your group.
We're lucky to have you. We've heard a lot about you from Aji, and
Okay.
we heard also a lot about you. I've heard about you numerous times through Jason Smith at the New York
Alex, you
Restoration
know
Project.
her as Dr. Henderson, not Aji. I don't know. Do you know her as Aji or Ann?
Yep. So Aji and I spent a little time together in Barbuda on a research trip. I got to know her then.
Okay.
That's what I thought. I had seen your talk about Barbuda trips together, so I figured you were not just colleagues but also friends.
Yeah.
But Jason Smith talks so highly of you also, and he refers to you as Dr. Zarnoch. And you know, you have helped him. You're very involved with the Swindler's Cove project. He told us.
Yep.
He's been very helpful. We've done a couple of field trips there, and he's one of our advisors, and we've been working behind the school on City Island. There's a little tidal wetland, and we're trying to restore it and bring in indigenous plants with the help of Paul Mankiewicz, who will be on the call later.
Okay.
And Jason's and Eric Sanderson, I'm sure you know him as well, have been advising us on this project.
He also lives on City Island.
Yeah, I knew that actually. Yeah.
You knew that?
Yeah, Eric, and Paul, right? Both
They
of them.
both, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. That's right. So I think that after what we hear you talk, and we've just sort of gotten to know something about you. I got really excited when I read about blue carbon, and the importance of rebuilding these. What you're gonna talk about tonight. That I think that we may want to ask you to be one of our advisors as well. But
So it's an audition.
well, we're auditioning for you. We want to.
Or a roping you in. So you teach at Baruch?
Yep, I teach at Baruch. Been there 13 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's good, and you know we've been working around New York City, you know, for even longer than 13 years. I did my graduate work at the CUNY Graduate Center, so I've been working in and around New York City for a long time.
Great.
So you know, like we're just now. Well, we're 2 years old. I don't know what you know about us, or less than 2 years, but we've done a lot, and we're a very committed group. And because we have so much community. Wait, you just jumped across the page. I was looking at you. Community involvement with restaurants and yacht clubs and a lot of the people on the island. And there's Aji and scientists and authors, and you know we're a very interesting group. And what am I trying to say exactly? We've accomplished so much in the year and a half that we've existed. So
That's exciting.
Yeah. In fact, Chester, two professors from CUNY, from the Hunter School of Animal and Behavior Division, Heike Neumeister and Thomas Preuss. I don't know if you know them. They've been very involved in this project. Heike unfortunately passed away at the end of August, but.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Yeah, but her husband is still involved with the project. I was curious if you've come across them. But it's a big system. CUNY is a large educational institution. There are many universities within it.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Aji, you're muted.
I'm having problems here. I'm working on it.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Good.
Um, I have to, Zoom is particular now, and I have to admit people. I can't just let people in. So I have to keep an eye on people waiting in the waiting room, make sure I let them in.
Hi, Inga. I haven't seen you in ages.
I think it's my computer, not, it has a mind of its own.
Uh-oh, watch out.
Oh, that's
How
the
many
problem.
how many
Yeah.
years did you two work together and in
We,
the CUNY system?
we didn't. I'm going to explain it in 2 seconds.
Oh, okay. I won't take away anything from your
Promise.
introduction.
But Chester said something, you went on a field project together, and I can't remember where was it?
Barbuda?
It was in Barbuda, but I'm getting there. Give me time. We got it. We got it.
We won't take your punchline away.
It's not much of a punchline. Don't worry.
Chester, we have a bunch of people on the call also. I've introduced you to a bunch. We just were joined by Rose Rodstrom, who's the co-chair of the City Island Oyster Reef Project. Barbara Delensek, board member, active board member. And Maria Caruso, also board member. And then other volunteers, Ted Port, Barbara Jones, Inga Unger, Ellen Riley.
Hi, Chester. Thank you for doing this for us. We're very excited to learn more about what you do and how, you know, we can learn from you and do it here on City Island.
Great, yeah, I'm happy to talk with you all.
We have Kate Mosher, I'm going to admit her now, from the Billion Oyster Project. Linda Baldwin, another advisor for the City Island Oyster Reef Group. So we're having a good mix. Everyone, just a quick reminder, once we start in a few minutes, to please mute while Dr. Zarnoch speaks. And then at the end, we're going to do a question and answer period. So when you are speaking, clearly unmute yourself. So it's so much better, the audio, that way, because we record these and then edit them and put them on our website. Would that be okay with you, Dr. Zarnoch? Can we do that?
That's fine.
Wonderful.
You won't hear my dogs, though.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell Teddy and Gypsy to be quiet. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. Chester, have you ever been out to City Island?
Yeah, I actually, I grew up in the Bronx and spent a lot of time as a kid on City Island, fishing and actually had my first job on City Island. I worked as a dockhand, Kretzer Marina. I don't know if it's still called Kretzer, but it was right just a little bit past where the bait and tackle shop was.
Oh,
It's now called Seafood City, unfortunately.
Oh, that's
It burned down many years ago and then got turned into a huge restaurant. Not a restaurant, a takeout place.
Not a good restaurant anyway.
That must have been a fun job as a young kid.
That was great. Yeah,
Yeah.
every day on the water during summer. That was incredible.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's 7:05, so why don't we start? I'm just going to say hello to everyone and really turn it over to Aji. We're so happy to have you here, Dr. Zarnoch. We've heard a lot about you through the New York Restoration Project and through Dr. Henderson. And as I mentioned, it's your talk on blue carbon and your work as a wetland scientist is so relevant to us because as the City Island Oyster Reef Group, a project we're working on currently is to restore a small wetlands area on City Island. So we're very interested in what your work and learning from you. Just a quick note for everyone, once again, if you don't mind muting yourself, please. during Dr. Zarnoch's talk, and at the end we'll have a question and answer session. And so without any further ado, I could turn it over to you, Aji, for an introduction of Dr. Zarnoch.
Thanks. I think I should explain how I know Chester, just because we met in Barbuda, and I don't know if this will show up or not, but it's a picture of a group of people, including me. I had spent a perfectly horrible 3 days trying to manage finding money. Oh. Yes. Anyway, a lot of those things that scientists do that don't have anything whatsoever to do with science. So I was actually whining, saying, I've been here days, I haven't been on the water, I haven't done anything that looked like what I'm supposed to be doing. So somebody said, look, the boat's going out, it's gonna be okay, you'll be fine. They got me an old pair of shorts and shirt from some student who had left it in the student dorm, the little tiny one there, and ran me down to the dock where these guys were waiting on me, looking like, oh crap. We've got the dean to take care of all afternoon, and we've got samples to collect. Admit it, that's the truth. They were really great once I was there and behaved myself. We had a great afternoon, and that's how I met Chester. He's done everything great that I love. He really has. He's worried about urban aquaculture. I can't even talk, agriculture, but most of all, the most important thing is that he's using New York City as a model. He serves as an advisor to students. He does research. He's published a lot of papers. Just a great guy. So the critical thing for me is that he's using New York City as a model. Chester, thanks. Bless you. Go.
Sure. So is it okay if I share my screen and give my presentation? Okay.
Whatever you want to do, it's up to you.
Can you all see that okay? Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Like I said, City Island has a special place in my heart. So I'm really happy that I'm getting a chance to talk to you guys that are doing really great work around the island. I am from Baruch College. That's where I do all my teaching and research. And those of you that are familiar with the CUNY system, you probably associate Baruch College as a business school, and it is. It's one of the largest business schools in the country, and certainly is known as the business school in the CUNY system. But here I am, a marine biologist at a business school, and it's sort of an amazing place to work because I get to interact with so many students that are going on into the business world. But I'm also part of the School of Arts and Sciences, and 80% of the student population at Baruch are business students, 20% are arts and sciences, and so Arts and Sciences School is kind of like a small liberal arts college inside a large public university. So I really tend to think about Baruch College and the arts and sciences at Baruch College as sort of being this really special entity, different from other CUNY schools, because it has that small liberal arts feel. And so if you know anybody, students that are thinking about coming to CUNY, think about Baruch for the sciences, because we're certainly a unique opportunity for students in a large public university. So there's my sales pitch for Baruch. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the work that we've been doing for the last several years on salt marshes and living shorelines. And in particular, we talk about blue carbon. I know Barbara's really excited about blue carbon. So I'm going to spend most of this discussion on blue carbon. But we do lots of other kinds of work in wetlands. We spent a lot of time studying oysters and oyster restoration, and we're really interested in water quality issues. And so we have sort of a diverse research program, but I'm going to mostly focus on wetlands and blue carbon. Most of you are familiar with the idea that New York has significant amount of wetlands. So you guys are over in the City Island area, surrounded by wetlands with Pelham Bay, the Pelham Bay Park area. And so overall, we have about 4,000 acres of wetlands in New York City, but unfortunately, we've lost a tremendous amount over time. And we continue to lose marshes. We're losing about 4 acres per year over the last 40 years, and in some places we're losing at an even greater rate. So, for example, in Jamaica Bay, where I spend a lot of my time doing research, there are salt marsh islands in the center of the bay that have been eroding or disappearing for a number of years, and at one point we were losing 30 acres per year. So you can see from this map here, this map shows a footprint of marsh islands in 1951, and then in purple, and then the 2003 footprint of these islands in green. And you can see a tremendous amount of loss in the center of the bay, and these center islands are critical to the community in the middle of Jamaica Bay called Broad Channel. And many folks in that area believe that the marshes protect that community during hurricanes and storm surges. And the same goes for some of the communities on the northern part of Jamaica Bay, like the Howard Beach area and Canarsie. So we're losing marshes, and we've lost marshes, you know, since we've came to New York, and a lot of the loss are because of development. You know, we're building on top of marshes. A great example of that is JFK Airport. You can see this here. This was built on salt marshes and was filled by taking sediment from this part of the bay called Grassy Bay, and built up its elevation, and then was paved over. The Belt Parkway was built on salt marshes, and so development is certainly a problem. Loss of sediment inputs has been another problem that we experienced in Jamaica Bay, especially, and other places as well. We've lost a lot of the creeks and rivers that would bring sediment and wash sediment off of land into the bays. And so sediment's important for helping marshes to grow and to accrete and to maintain their elevation with rising sea levels. And more recently, we've learned that nitrogen contributes to the loss of marshes. And so nitrogen is mainly coming from wastewater treatment plants all around the city. And that nitrogen leads to greater rates of decomposition. And so the marshes kind of collapse on themselves as they decompose at an elevated rate. So we've experienced a tremendous amount of salt marsh loss in New York City. And this is sort of what it looks like. This is Jamaica Bay. These are some recent pictures in Jamaica Bay, one of the marshes close to JFK Airport. And you can see the edge of the marsh is being sort of undercut, starting to collapse on itself here. And this is a picture of a marsh in the western part of Long Island, South Shore of Long Island. And you can see this is the peat that the marsh was once living on, the plants were once living on, and the plants have eroded from this area and are kind of migrating inward. So we've experienced this kind of loss of marsh in New York City and elsewhere. And when we lose the marsh, we lose the important services that they provide to us. Salt marshes and other kinds of vegetated habitats really provide a tremendous amount of services to humans, in particular, things like nutrient cycles, habitat for fish and invertebrates. They stabilize shorelines and sediments and keep them in place, prevent them from getting eroded away. They attenuate waves or minimize the force of waves that come onto shore. And they sequester carbon, which is an important service now as we deal with the climate change crisis. And because they provide these services, over the last 30 years or so, we've put a lot of energy and money into trying to restore or recreate these kinds of habitats. And so I know you guys are involved in a tidal wetland restoration project on City Island. And there's been a number of projects all around New York City. I think it's 25 or 30 projects around the city where wetlands, marshes have been restored. And so you can see here, this is a picture of a living shoreline. And so we know living shorelines are shorelines that are created to protect coastal property. And they integrate wetlands as well as more of what you consider gray infrastructure like rock revetments you can see here. And again, this is really just to protect the upland area, which is, this is Randall's Island and an area called the Bronx Kill. And many of you that live in New York City have probably driven over the Bronx Kill as you've gone over the Triborough Bridge. It's this little creek that goes in between Randall's Island and the Bronx. So restoration is an important activity that's ongoing in New York City and elsewhere. It's being done to restore ecosystem services. It's being done to protect coastal property in the face of climate change, sea level rise, and the greater frequency and intensity of coastal storms that we're experiencing associated with climate change. My research has really been focused on these two services, the nutrient cycling and the carbon sequestration. And so over the last several years, this has sort of been the questions that I've focused on in my research. Overarching goal is to evaluate the effectiveness of restored marshes in the way in which they provide ecosystem services. And we're particularly interested in nitrogen removal. And so the idea that we have excess nitrogen going into our ecosystems from wastewater, and that's contributing to eutrophic conditions. So the kinds of things where you get algae blooms and fish kills, and low oxygen events that contribute to the degradation of our local ecosystems. And so nitrogen removal is a natural process that's performed by bacteria, and in certain kinds of habitats like wetlands, it can be enhanced. So we've been studying nitrogen removal in wetlands, oyster reefs, and other habitats for a number of years now. And of course, we're also studying carbon sequestration. And I think what makes New York City as a really great model for addressing these kinds of questions is that, it's obviously, highly urban, highly eutrophic. It has just a tremendous amount of nitrogen inputs. And of course, we're investing in restoring habitats. So it's a great place to be doing this kinds of work. And this is another living shoreline on Randall's Island, Little Hellgate Marsh. And again, you can see sort of the incorporation of gray infrastructure, the rock, revetment, and then you have the marsh grasses. So I'm going to sort of focus this presentation on carbon. I love talking about nitrogen. I love talking about nitrogen removal. If any folks are interested in talking about that, I'm happy to come back and talk to you guys about my work on nitrogen. But in the sake of time, we'll focus on carbon today. And so carbon that's sequestered by vegetated marine habitats is often called blue carbon. And so this is the carbon dioxide that's pulled from the atmosphere and stored by these kinds of marine plants. And so there's three kinds of habitats that sequester carbon in coastal ecosystems. One's mangroves, and Aji, this is a picture of one of the mangroves that we visited when we were out in Barbuda. Another type of habitat that sequesters carbon in coastal ecosystems is salt marshes. And here we have a marsh from Jamaica Bay, and then seagrasses or subtidal grasses. We don't have any seagrasses in the New York City area, but out in Great South Bay and out in the forks of Long Island, we do have some seagrass that's out there. So let me explain blue carbon to you folks a little bit more carefully. The carbon is being sequestered into these habitats, and it's being sequestered into the plants themselves, and also into the soils that they live in. And they can sequester significant amounts of this carbon, particularly in the soils, because the soils tend to be an environment where you don't have a lot of decomposition. So the plant material gets deposited there and stays there for long periods of time without being broken down. In the same way that might occur in like you can imagine a terrestrial forest, the forest around Pelham Bay. You have all of the trees losing their leaves. Those leaves are full of carbon. They get deposited into the soil in that forest habitat, but they get decomposed relatively quickly in that habitat. It's different from these marine habitats where that decomposition process is very slow. So that's really an important feature that sort of distinguishes these marine habitats from terrestrial habitats. And because of that, the marine habitats sequester more carbon than terrestrial habitats. And as you can see, this data shows how much more carbon sequestered as compared to a tropical forest. To try and put this in these numbers in perspective, we can imagine like a big truck, a Hummer, for example. A Hummer that drives 15,000 miles a year would probably emit about 11 tons of carbon dioxide. A Prius would probably emit about 3.5 tons of carbon dioxide. A hectare or 2.5 acres of salt marsh will sequester 8 tons of carbon dioxide each year. So it gives you an idea of how much carbon it can pull into the environment and store it. And it can store it for long periods of time, as long as the marshes are healthy. So how does it happen? Well, the plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to go through photosynthesis. And so they're converting that CO2 into their biomass, their roots, their stems, and so on. And there's an exchange of carbon dioxide because they also have to respire just like you and I. As we're sitting here, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The plants do the same. As they break down that sugar that they produce through photosynthesis, they're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And so there should be some balance between how much is being taken up through photosynthesis and how much is being released through respiration. The way storage happens is mainly when the plants die at the end of the year, or the above ground part of the plant dies at the end of the year, you have that plant litter sort of landing in the marsh and being retained in the marsh. You also have organic carbon from phytoplankton cells, from detritus in the water column that gets deposited on the marsh. And then again becomes part of the soil. And I kind of broke this image down so you can see sort of we have the part of the soil that's aerobic, where there's oxygen. And then a little deeper, you have the anaerobic parts of the soil, or where there's no oxygen. And so where you have aerobic soil, you can have decomposition. And so you have carbon dioxide going back into the atmosphere through decomposition. But when you get down into the anaerobic sediment or soils, you have less, if any, decomposition. And so that's when that carbon can be retained. And so this just gives you an idea of the sort of the seasonal change that you experience in a marsh, spring to summer, fall to winter. And so this plant material that grows all summer dies in the fall, at least the above ground stuff dies in the fall, and then it can get retained in the marsh. And by the following spring, all of this old organic material can be slowly be incorporated back into the soil. And that's a really important way in which carbon is sequestered. So over time, each season, each year, you're adding more and more carbon, and essentially you add layer upon layer of plant litter and carbon to your soil, and you end up having this deep soil horizon that's full of organic carbon. Okay, so that's the process in which burial and carbon sequestration happens in these marshes. So we're interested in being able to quantify blue carbon, and because we're starting to think about it as an alternative approach to mitigating climate change. Okay, it's very clear that we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, and we need to implement policies that that make that happen. But we're also looking at other ways in which we can address the climate change crisis, and quantifying blue carbon, using it as a tool to mitigate CO2 is now being explored, and there are some policies that have been implemented in some states where it is a part of an accounting process for CO2. And so if you're going to use it for carbon policies, we need to be able to quantify it effectively. And so basically the way in which we measure carbon, blue carbon, is by measuring the carbon pools in a wetland. So we want to be able to measure the soil carbon. So the way we do that is by taking sediment cores and then measuring the amount of carbon throughout the core, from the surface all the way down, generally to about 1 meter deep. We'll also measure the above ground plant carbon, so what we see in terms of the leaves and the stems, and the below ground plant carbon, so the roots and the rhizomes of the plants. So those are our pools, and we also have to keep in mind that there's some fluxes that are occurring, right? We know that carbon is fluxing into the plants through photosynthesis, and then there's a release of carbon through decomposition and respiration. So we also want to be able to measure those fluxes of carbon, and so we often use this tool here to measure carbon dioxide fluxes out in the marshes themselves. And here we have a student working on some of the sediment samples from our marshes. So New York is working on its own carbon policies, and they have a deadline of the end of the year to be able to come up with an economic value for carbon. You're probably familiar with some of the estimates on trying to address climate change through carbon accounting, social cost of carbon, for example. New York State is working on developing their own estimate of carbon using this Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And so hopefully by the end of the year, they'll have an estimate. And then from there, then we can start thinking about other ways in which we can implement carbon accounting, perhaps blue carbon, in our carbon policies. So we've spent some time quantifying blue carbon in and around New York City. One place that we've spent some time is Jamaica Bay. We've also spent some time working in the Harlem River. And I know you guys are familiar with Jason Smith and the work that they've done at Swindler's Cove and Sherman Creek Park. We've also worked at Moscato Marsh, where this was a restored marsh by New York City Parks over by the Columbia Boathouse. And a couple of the marshes on Randall's Island as well. And we quantified blue carbon by measuring those pools: sediment carbon or soil carbon pool, above ground plant and below ground plant pools. And we only measured down to a depth of 15 centimeters. Like I told you before, generally when you're measuring blue carbon, you'll measure down to 1 meter. And the reason why we only measure down to 15 centimeter at these marshes, because several of these marshes were built on fill. Like 20% of New York City is built on fill, but these marshes were built on fill, and so you can only get so far. You only can go down so far before you start hitting things like rubble and rock and so on. And so essentially, what I'm saying is that we're likely underestimating our carbon at some of these marshes because we didn't go down as deep as we could. And so then if we try and put a value on this, we went ahead and used the price of carbon, what it's trading at, which is about $40 a ton, and we came up with some estimates of how much the economic value is of stored carbon in Harlem River marshes, and then we compared it to some other habitats like New York City trees and New York City soils, and we can see that the Harlem River marshes store more carbon, and therefore are more economically valuable in a carbon market as compared to these terrestrial habitats. So if we're going to think about blue carbon in terms of policies and carbon accounting, we need to be able to measure it. We also really want to understand how we can continue to grow blue carbon in New York City, how we can protect existing marshes. And so we have a fairly good idea overall of what the drivers of blue carbon are and what the threats are. But what we are lacking is an understanding of the mechanisms that work in each of these processes at a local scale. And when I say at a local scale, I talk about New York City as a whole, but even more local because we know that systems within New York City can be quite different from each other. The Harlem River is quite different from Jamaica Bay, which is quite different from Long Island Sound. And so we need to be able to quantify blue carbon. Two, we want to be able to understand the mechanisms that lead to blue carbon and in particular, successful restoration projects. And so these are some of the factors that we really need to take into consideration when we study blue carbon, and hopefully we can do some more science to sort of address these. So when we think about blue carbon in New York City, I would really support all efforts that we can possibly make to conserve existing marsh. Like I said, we have about 4,000 acres in New York City, of marshes in New York City. We need to do everything in our power to protect these existing marshes. And believe it or not, we still have wetlands in New York that are getting developed.
No, just watch.
So
Right there.
we do
When
need
the
to
person's talking
protect
about
this
something.
existing habitat. And then we
Please
start
just
to think
listen.
going forward in the coming decades, as we're dealing with climate change. We need to think about what's going to happen to these marshes. So generally, when sea levels rise, a marsh will migrate inland. And in New York City, many of our marshes don't have the ability to migrate inland because they're adjacent to development, roads, parking lots, people's homes, etc. And so going forward, we want to start thinking about, are there marshes that we can address the barriers to landward migration, where we might be able to allow these marshes to migrate inland so that they can persist with rising sea levels. And so there may be places now that flood, that are homes that people no longer can live in and we can buy out, where we might be able to create potential habitat for marshes. And then in the future, we know that there are going to be places that are going to be flooded or flood prone, so much so that we can't have homes or businesses existing there. And we're talking, a couple of decades from now, because of sea level rise. And so maybe we need to start thinking about the opportunities to create habitat in these flood prone zones. So in terms of maintaining and expanding blue carbon conservation, and then thinking about migration of marshes is critical. In the meantime, we also are actively restoring habitat. And generally the way in which we restore marshes is by increasing their elevation. And so by perhaps putting sediment on marshes so that they avoid getting drowned and they can have a high enough elevation to persist. Sometimes we need to rebuild marshes or rebuild marsh edges. And so we really need to learn a lot more about how restoration works, and in particular, understanding restoration in the context of blue carbon. And so that's been a major focus of my work. This is some pictures of restored marshes in Jamaica Bay, some of the islands that I showed the map of that were disappearing. This is called Elders East, and you can see the marsh is all fragmented and was drowning and eroding away, and large multi-agency restoration effort led to the reconstruction of the island. And so you can see they brought in dredged sediment and rebuilt the island, and then they planted it with the salt marsh plants. And so this is another island that was recently planted. And so there's these large-scale efforts. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on these restoration efforts, and it's interesting. We spend so much money on building habitat, but we spend so little money on doing the research to determine if these things would be successful, or doing the monitoring to adapt restoration projects as the environment changes. And so my research has really been focused on these restoration projects and trying to determine if they will be able to achieve the kinds of ecosystem services that natural marshes achieve, and natural marshes provide to us. And if so, how long will it take? And so you can see, I have this sort of this graph here. It could take, we know from published literature on projects that have been done down south and elsewhere, it could take years to decades for certain ecosystem functions to be restored in created marshes. And we don't know how this could potentially work in New York City, where we have this constant threat of urbanization and high nitrogen conditions. So this has been sort of a major focus of my work. And in order for marshes to be successful, restored marshes to be successful, and thus blue carbon for carbon storage to occur, you need certain things to happen. We need high levels of primary production. So all the plants that we put down need to be able to produce lots of life, to expand and produce lots of carbon the way in which natural marshes would. We need those plants to be able to trap sediments to enhance the elevation and also trap carbon. And then, of course, we need the microbial conditions that support sequestration and minimize decomposition, so that we have carbon stored rather than carbon being recycled back into the atmosphere. And so in order for these conditions to be met, environmental context is critical. So I've mentioned nitrogen loading as being a major contributor to the loss of marshes. So we really need to understand how restored marshes function, behave, succeed under conditions of nitrogen loading, and then other environmental variables as well. So the environmental context is important. And again, that's when as I mentioned before, the whole idea that we need to understand drivers of blue carbon at a local level, and in particular in New York City, we need to be able to distinguish between the environmental context in Jamaica Bay versus Long Island Sound versus Harlem River, so that these projects can be successful. So one of the projects that I've been working on for a few years now in Jamaica Bay is looking at a series of restored marshes in the center of the bay. So I showed you this map before that shows you how the marshes are eroding, and government agencies have restored several marshes in the bay. The earliest was Big Egg Marsh in 2003. A newer marsh was Yellow Bar in 2012. And so you kind of have this chrono sequence. A marsh was restored every couple of years. And so this, to me, provided a really unique opportunity to look at how marshes might change through time without having to study a marsh for decades. Right, so it's what we call a space for time substitution approach. Rather than studying one site over a large number of years, we have several sites that were restored in a similar fashion, that are located in an area close to each other, that are different ages. And so we can sort of look at the trajectory of ecosystem functioning in each of these marshes to make predictions of what's going to happen in the future. So we've worked at these restoration sites, and we also had reference sites, a degraded marsh, which is Black Bank, and then a stable marsh, which is called the Joko Marsh. And so I could show you a little bit of data on our carbon storage that we found in Jamaica Bay. And so what we're looking at here are the restored marshes in green from the youngest to the oldest. And then the natural marshes that are our reference marshes, the degraded marsh and the stable marsh. And we see an increase through time in the amount of carbon that's stored in the restored marshes, but it's nowhere near the amount of carbon that's stored in the natural marshes. And based on this trajectory, it would take many decades for these restored marshes to achieve the carbon storage of the natural marshes. And we don't know if these restored marshes will last that long, or if they will be able to persist, if they will be essentially if they're able to persist long enough to achieve this kind of carbon storage. So so certainly this is a concern. We start thinking about restoration in Jamaica Bay and other places. And so if we look at where the carbon is stored in these marshes, I showed you an image earlier of carbon storage in mangroves and seagrasses and tropical forests. And in all those examples, most of the carbon was stored in the soil. And in our natural marshes, Black Bank, Joko, most of the carbon, about 70%, is stored in the soil. In the restored marshes, we have less carbon being stored in the soil. Okay, more than half is stored in the plant material. And so we're not getting the carbon storage into the sediment that we need in order to achieve the kinds of sequestration that we would want in order to be equivalent to natural marshes. And so here I'm going to show you some data from the Harlem River, and same thing, we're looking at the pools of carbon, and what we see that's interesting about the Harlem River is that we have a lot of carbon that's being sequestered in the roots. We call it the below ground biomass, the roots and the rhizomes. And so this is really interesting to us. We have a lot more carbon sequestered here, kind of similar amounts sequestered in the soil. But why is it that these Harlem River marshes are storing more carbon in their roots, and there's a lot less of that carbon storage in the Jamaica Bay marshes? And again, this goes back to this sort of, understanding differences across systems. And so one of the things that's really different about Jamaica Bay versus the Harlem River is that they have different amounts of sediment in the water. So Jamaica Bay is a sediment-starved ecosystem. We've essentially cut off all the sediment inputs into Jamaica Bay through development. Okay, the watershed around Jamaica Bay is almost entirely concrete and blacktop. So we don't have a lot of sediment coming into it. And so it's a sediment-starved system. The Harlem River, on the other hand, gets a lot of sediment from the Hudson River. And so we have a high sediment load in the Harlem River. Both systems have high nitrogen loads. And when you have high nitrogen loads, it makes the plants grow taller. And when the plants grow taller, the water, as the water hits the plants, it slows down the flow and sediment settles down. Okay, so in Jamaica Bay, you have less sediment in the water, so you have less sediment capture. But in the Harlem River, you have a lot more sediment in the water, so you have a lot more sediment capture and that sediment has carbon. And that that sediment is important to help the plants maintain their elevation, to continue to grow higher. And so in Jamaica Bay, the plant's elevation may not be growing as much, and so you have less of this carbon storage, while in the Harlem River, you have more of this carbon storage in the roots, because the roots have to grow with that accreting sediment. So Jamaica Bay relies upon capturing organic carbon, mainly from the water column from phytoplankton. So Jamaica Bay is sort of in an interesting situation, because they are losing marshes because of nitrogen, but the nitrogen contributes to the amount of carbon that's in the water. The nitrogen contributes to phytoplankton production. So that carbon that's in the water is lots of phytoplankton. And that phytoplankton is what's increasing the vertical marsh growth. So Jamaica Bay is in this really peculiar situation where nitrogen is killing marshes, but nitrogen may also be sustaining marshes. So it's a interesting case. So to sort of summarize what we have learned thus far about blue carbon, there's great potential for blue carbon in New York City, particularly through maintaining existing marshes and reducing barriers to inland migration, and then through restoration, where restoration can be performed successfully. We know the marshes in Jamaica Bay are thriving, but not necessarily sequestering carbon. So environmental context is critical in understanding the different ecosystem services. Now, I can say that the marshes in Jamaica Bay are really good at removing nitrogen, even though they're not sequestering carbon as great as those in the Harlem River. So what I propose as we move forward in trying to understand wetlands and blue carbon potential is to integrate research projects into these large management projects, into these restoration projects. We need to be doing science with the restoration so that we can learn about the interactions, about the drivers, about the mechanisms that make these projects successful, and that that result in significant and meaningful ecosystem services like nitrogen removal and carbon sequestration. So an example where we're integrating research into management action is through the New York Restoration Project's Sherman Creek Living Shoreline. I know you folks are familiar with this project. So the New York Restoration Project has partnered with us at Baruch College to measure ecosystem services from their living shoreline. So we went out last year and took a bunch of measurements from the existing habitat, and this year we're now doing measurements after construction of the living shoreline. And so this is the living shoreline was constructed this summer, and so you can see there the oyster castles and their marsh that they're building, and we are measuring ecosystem services from these structures. We're also measuring biodiversity, and so this is my invertebrate biology class that we were out there a few weeks ago measuring biodiversity. This is a picture of the mudflat at the site before construction and then after construction. So you can see here you have the oyster castles that are designed to create habitat for the oysters, and also to, probably more importantly, to minimize wave action that has been eroding the shoreline over here. And so here's another shot of the castles and the marsh restoration, and my students out there measuring invertebrate diversity. Here are what the marsh restoration looks like. So at this site, it's a high wave energy environment, and so they restored the plants into this sort of coconut fiber mattress in order to sort of retain those plants, prevent them from getting eroded away. It's not something that was done in Jamaica Bay. In Jamaica Bay, the plants are put directly into the sediment. And when we were out there a couple of weeks ago, we did find that the oyster castles have baby oysters on them. So there's oysters recruiting to that habitat, and we'll be back out there in a few weeks to do a quantitative assessment on the oyster castles. So I'll just finish up by acknowledging our funders: Hudson River Foundation, New York Waters Research Institute, New York Sea Grant, CUNY, our partners, and the many students that have been involved in the work. And I'm just part of a great team of scientists that have all contributed to these projects. So I guess I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions. So Aji, you have to unmute yourself.
Well, I'll start by saying, as Aji, you unmute yourself, it was a fascinating lecture and so relevant for us. So your research in Jamaica Bay, very interesting and informative. And I know that a lot of people out there have questions, a lot of questions popping up already as you were speaking about as it ties into our restoration project. So Aji, would you like to start or just make a comment, or please fire away?
Yeah, just thank you very much. I do have a question, but it's not a fair question. If you lived on City Island near the water, what would you plant? I know it would depend on where you lived, but what would you plant if you just had a house here?
So low marsh, Spartina alterniflora.
Probably.
Yeah.
So low marsh. What about mid marsh and high meadow?
So, you know, I haven't been around the island in many years. So I'm going back to my, what I recall as a kid. But I think that there's a pretty steep elevation. And I think that slope is really important in making your decisions about where to restore and what to restore. You really want to make sure you have the elevation right for all of those plants. If your high marsh plants are getting inundated too often, they're not going to last. The low marsh plants can manage with inundation, but the high marsh plants will not. So you just want to make sure that you have a high enough elevation that those plants aren't getting submerged too often.
So we're kind of just like starting out this whole like restoration project at the site behind the school, and it's a site that has been like kind of abandoned for many years, and we're trying to restore the salt marsh, as best we can. But at the same time, we need to like kind of like learn from people like you, like what are the best plants to put out there. And we're just starting this process, and we're doing like goldenrod, and we're like doing like certain indigenous plants. But at the same time, as much as we can get people like you to like help us like figure out what are the best like steps to take.
Yeah, no, it's daunting. I think there's so many things that you need to take into consideration when you're doing it. I think that I really feel like elevation is critical. So trying to get some information on that is would probably one of the first things I do. I don't know if you guys have had any interaction with New York City parks, but they are a wealth of knowledge. New York City parks have been restoring marshes, since we started in New York, and they have a tremendous amount of experience. So I definitely would bring them into the fold so that you could take advantage of their experience.
Right. So we have parks on our side, and they're like out there, working with us, and we have Greenbelt like giving us plants, and we have all kinds of like resources that way. But this, I mean, like this presentation that you gave tonight was very, very educational for a lot of us, and like very, like understandable, like how you made it, like, like just understanding the whole nitrogen and carbon element of plants. But if you want to be involved with us in the future, as far as like being a partner to us, we like very much appreciate that. And this has been very educational and helpful.
Yeah, I'm happy to participate. I'm happy to come out there and have a look, and I can help you guys collect some data on elevation. Yeah, I mean, when Aji asked, I was hesitant to respond because I'm not that familiar with the site, and really that's got to be the first thing before I can really advise you.
Can I ask a question, Chester? I'm sorry, Barbara.
That's okay.
We have a breakwater that surrounds kind of the perimeter of the marshland. And you used another term when you were talking about the various marshlands in Jamaica Bay. You used another term, big rocks.
The rock revetments, yeah.
The rock, what did you say?
Revetments?
Revetments, the rock revetments. So we have something very similar along the perimeter of the coastline in this little tidal marshland. And what are your thoughts on that? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Or should there be an alternate way to protect the shoreline?
So it really depends on the site. I think that there are some places where it's absolutely necessary. High wave, high energy type environments where you will need that breakwater in order for the marsh to persist. And then there are other cases where it might not be necessary. So it really depends upon the hydrodynamic conditions at the site.
On the site that we're working with has two different parts, and one that's toward the south is protected by land that goes out. This is an old boatyard where there were docks going way out, and they deteriorated over the years and then were removed by the Army Corps in the 90s, and there were huge sort of semicircular piles of rocks put in to protect the upland, shoreland. However, this one section that's toward the south is also protected by this abutment, and there's a ton of spartina grass growing there because it gets the flow in and out, and so it's underwater half the day and above water the rest. The other section, there's a little group of spartina plants, but there's not going to be any more until we can protect that area more from tidal flow, from currents, from the rest of it. I live on the other side of the island, on the west side, and I have a huge amount of spartina grass, and that runs all the way around, all the way from Tier Street all the way to Ditmars Street. And because the tidal, it's the currents are not so bad, the tidal flow is less. It's Eastchester Bay rather than Long Island Sound. Mm. So, but spartina is the only grass that is there. Are there other grasses that we should be planting? I'd love to get eelgrass, but I know that's sort of an underwater plant. But how does one start putting those in place?
So, eelgrass is tricky. It's a very sensitive species, sensitive to temperature, and sensitive to light. So I probably wouldn't go down that road with eelgrass. I think focusing on the spartina I think makes the most sense.
It certainly is protective. My seawall loves it because it's protected by it. Yeah, and so but I do think that what we should think about doing at the place behind PS 175 is creating some kind of a barrier to protect spartina in this other section that's largely sand at the moment, or rocks. but mostly sand.
So
it's
you know that you do know, Chester, that Paul Mankiewicz is working with us, but I think we would love to have more collaboration in terms of the
Mhm.
design. Right now Rose mentioned that we're planting, but it's the high marshland. It's not, I mean, above the water. What's that
Mhm.
Yeah.
called? What's that? Anyhow, it's not the marshland.
Well, it's upland. Yeah.
Upland, yes, the upland part. That's what we're sort of working on right now. But in terms, as we move down, sort of the design of what we want to do, I think you, in terms of what you did in with Jason and his group in Fiddler's Cove, was there a design plan and you worked out before you actually began tackling it? What was the process involved? And how did the decisions get made?
So I wasn't involved in the design process. They have, New York Restoration Project has an engineer, a landscape design engineer, and so they came up with the design. There is a little bit of high marsh Spartina patens, very small patch of it. Majority of the plants is the salt marsh plants that they put out is the Spartina alterniflora.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the oyster castles, do they provide protection for the plants too, the water plants?
Yeah, so that's the similar idea as the breakwaters.
Yeah.
You
No,
know,
I think we should do that. Yeah.
yeah, and I think I'm pretty sure that Jason's plan with the oyster castles was modeled after a living shoreline that was built in Long Island Sound on the Stamford side, Stamford, Connecticut.
That's right. He did show us pictures of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was the same idea, a different structure, but same idea.
Right.
So all the more reason we should be doing oysters. Yes.
Well, I think if you're going to be planting in a high energy environment, which if I understand correctly is the southeast side of the island, right?
Right.
Southeast side.
Yes.
Yeah. So then yeah, you might need to provide some protection.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much south, it's sort of mid-island.
Mid
But it
island.
is east.
It is east, though.
Yeah.
Definitely east. Yeah.
No, but it doesn't get that heavy hurricane, it's anyhow.
The water is exceptionally deep in that area. It's called City Island Harbor traditionally, and that's where all the boat yards were built over there because they could handle boats with very, deep keels, which is not true on the west side of the island where more silt has come in. But on the east side where we are, this area, the water does get quite deep going out. And so there may be more sort of tidal pull than there is on the west side.
I have a question for Chester. It has to do with, you said that you would take questions about nitrogen capture removal, even though it wasn't part of your presentation. And I know that we have more of an, perhaps a nitrogen problem on the west side of the island. We certainly have pollution coming down the Hudson River. And so I was wondering whether certain plants are better for nitrogen capture than others, and should we be considering that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that I think when we think about where the nitrogen's coming from, it is important in answering that question. So in the case of New York City, City Island, the nitrogen is in the water, and as compared to, let's say, Long Island, where the nitrogen's coming from overland and is washing off through runoff, or is coming from groundwater. And so when it's coming from land, it has to filter through the wetland from the landward side to the seaward side. So which plants is different compared to our situation where the nitrogen is coming from the seaward side. So in our situation, since the nitrogen is coming from the sea, we really want to be thinking about Spartina alterniflora because that's going to be that first line of defense, that first area that's where where it's going to be exposed the most to nitrogen, right? Those Photina alterniflora is the one that's submerged the longest, and so it's going to be exposed to that nitrogen the longest amount of time, and so that's the kind of plant that would, in this case, would probably remove the most amount of nitrogen. And I think the other part of that is you have to consider the kinds of environmental conditions that the bacteria require to turn reactive nitrogen into nitrogen gas. And those environmental conditions are more likely to occur in the seaward side of the marsh.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lots to think about.
Well, Chester, I think we've taken up a lot of your time and very much appreciate the time you took this evening to talk about your interesting work. And we will love to have you come out to City Island to see our site and give you a tour, and would welcome any input that you have in the future. And really, we're so thankful for your taking the time this evening.
Sure, my pleasure. It's nice meeting everybody, and yeah, let's follow up. I'd love to come back out to City Island and
Great.
see your site.
Great.
Good.
Thank you, Chester.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.